Well, good morning, all, or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. And welcome to, this is the fourth episode of CppChat. And this time we have a new chatter joining us. That's Howard Hinnant. Howard works at Ripple Labs, isn't it? Is that the name?
Actually, we just changed our name to just Ripple.
Oh, okay.
Drop the labs.
Okay. So you want to talk a little bit about what Ripple's about?
So we are in the digital currency industry. The basic mission of Ripple is to ultimately allow people to exchange value over the internet just as easily as we can email over the internet today.
More reliably.
More reliably, securely, and without all the spam. And so that's our long-term main goal, and so to do that we're using blockchain technology, and it's a very exciting field to work in, and I've been there for a couple of years now, and it's a wonderful company, and I'm just thrilled to be there. Okay.
I think your lower third is it's wrapping Ripple. People can't see the name of Ripple.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can correct that.
Yes. We also have returning Michael Caisse. People have been missing Michael. He's got a fan, I noticed, on Reddit. The announcement for the show, somebody said, "Michael, yay," or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was. But you got a fan out there, Michael.
They were pointing out a typo, I think.
Oh, is that what it was?
His name wrong.
Well, I figured it was you guys were being too mellow the last couple of weeks, and they needed somebody to actually argue with Bryce.
No, I believe it was because you spelled his name wrong.
And I was too clueless to realize that's what they were saying. I just noticed it's like, Michael, okay.
It's all good. It's all good.
Glad Michael's got a fan. Well, we're very glad to have you back, Michael. People didn't know this, but Michael was protesting how much I'm paying him to be on the show, so I've negotiated that I'm going to pay him twice as much now. And
protest works.
Yes. And Bryce returns.
Hi.
How are they going in Berkeley, Bryce? Has the fog burned off there?
No, it is still cold and unpleasant and early. But I'm doing pretty well.
Well, glad to have you on the show. So lots of interesting stuff going on. Maybe we should save the move from state till later, because I think it's going to be a lot of discussion. But maybe we should jump right into it. So one of the things that happened this week is that Jonathan Mueller, who blogs under the name Foo Nathan, or that's the name of the blog anyway, published a blog post about move safety, and he tried to come up with move safety guidelines that kind of parallel the exception safety guidelines, having these basic safety and then kind of incrementally more levels of safety. And a few weeks ago he published something on his blog, and I kind of jumped in there and I said, this advice you're giving doesn't make sense and it's not good. And so but I didn't really know who he was. I saw a link to the blog, I read it, and I disagreed, so I made this comment. Oh, good point. Where is he? Let's see. I think this is, there's his blog. And so now here I am again in a position of giving a comment on here and saying I disagree. And I'm just delighted at this guy. He was on CppCast a few weeks ago, and I'm sure they didn't realize this, because at the end they said, and by the way, how's it going in your academic career? And he said, well, I'm going to start college this fall. This guy's a high school kid, and he has a GitHub repository and a blog that has attracted the attention of CppCast, and they invited him on to appear on the show without realizing that he's still a high school kid. So I hate to be the guy who, whatever he says, I jump all over him. I love him, and you know, I want to make certain he applies to be a student volunteer at C++ Now next year.
Seconded.
Who could we talk to? Who runs that program anyway? Anyway, so I read it, and here's the synopsis of what I'm saying. What he calls the basic guarantee, which I think we all agree with that, which is that a move from object must be assignable and destructible. And then he has these other levels of move from objects. And my position is that just talking about it in those terms encourages people to use moved from objects in inappropriate ways. What I'm saying is that the well-designed library will maintain that any operation on a move from object other than destruction or assignment is undefined behavior. That's my position. And I was kind of surprised at the comment that Howard added. You didn't really take a position on what I said, but it seemed like you were sympathetic to what Jonathan was saying. So what were you trying to say, Howard?
Well, I'm basically here to represent the committee's position. I can tell you what the standard says, and if you want to interact with the standard library, there are requirements that you must build into your class, with respect to the moved from state. So, for example, if you look at chapter 24 of the standard, that's the algorithms chapter. And for every different algorithm, the algorithm will list all these things that your class has to do if you're going to use your class with that algorithm. For example, standard sort. It's got to be swappable, move constructible, move assignable, and it's got to be comparable with whatever operator you supply, and which defaults to operator less than, of course. Now, the standard doesn't say anything about these requirements with respect to the moved from state, which means that even if your object is moved from, it still has to be less than comparable. Now, any implementation I'm aware of would have to be nuts to actually compare a moved from object, but it's currently allowed to. So,
is that recognized as a bug? Is there anybody like me screaming about that?
Nobody is screaming about it. It's a characteristic that I realized before we standardized C++ 11. This is not shocking to me, but nobody has pushed to alter the requirements on standard sort such that the implementation is not allowed to compare moved from objects. If somebody wanted to do that, I wouldn't object. I think that'd be a great addition.
If that was added, would a line of code in any current implementation require changing?
I can only speak about one implementation, and as far as I know, no, nothing would need to be changed.
Can you speculate about other implementations? Is there any reason to have an implementation that would do that would compare on a move from object?
I can't think of one. However, I have seen another algorithm in another library, reverse. There's an algorithm that takes a sequence and reverses it. There used to be an implementation where if you put in an odd number of elements, well, the way the algorithm works is you swap ends. You march from the front, march from the back, and you swap elements. So there used to be an implementation of this algorithm, where if you put in an odd number of elements, it would swap the middle element with itself.
Uh-huh.
And if that calls the standard swap, that's basically swapping with itself. If you do that, you get a move assignment to yourself. So your type, if you want to use reverse, it ought to be able to handle that.
So what is that? What is the position of self-move? Does that require that we have to do a self-move check? I thought you had argued that self-move checks were contrary to the point of move semantics because it adds overhead for something that's supposed to be really fast.
My position, and what I would like the standard to say if it doesn't already, is that self-move should leave the object in a valid but unspecified state. Doesn't have to be a no-op.
But it has to, you have to protect from it. You can't you can't say that the burden to not self-move is on the caller.
That is correct, but it doesn't always require a check. For example, if you self-move a vector, typically the result is that you end up with an empty vector as opposed to the original state. And that'll be fine if you self-swap.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so one of the things that I think about when I think about, the Standards Committee has in fact documented that I believe, and you're the guy who would correct me if I was wrong on this, but I believe that the Standard Committee has said that for all standard containers, or maybe all standard objects in the standard library, when moved from, all functions with no preconditions are still callable.
That's exactly correct.
Okay, and it turns out that I'm certain that if that was an expensive guarantee to make, there would have been discussion about that probably didn't happen, because I think for vector and for most standard containers that's probably not difficult, right? I mean, there's probably no additional cycles. You just have to make sure you've designed your library in such a way that your moved from object is essentially an empty object.
That is also correct.
Okay. The problem I have is that that's not going to be the case with all objects. In some cases, trying to maintain that, and that was, I think, one of the levels of safety that Jonathan called out in his blog, was that all types with no prerequisites can be called and behave properly. And I would imagine that for most types that's trivial to implement. But I don't want. I don't think that's true for all types. But more importantly, I don't think there's a good use case for it. That's what I've been mostly harping about. I mean, I remember listening to Eric Niebler talking about this and basically saying, we have a name for invariants that don't always hold. We call them not invariants. And so he was saying, if you said this is my type, these are the invariants, those have to hold after being moved from. And I just think that isn't true, because you wouldn't expect them to hold after your object is destroyed, right? You call the destructor, you don't expect the variants to hold. And all I'm saying is that a moved from object is in a state that is, it's not completely destroyed, but it's in a special state. And it's in that state where we don't expect the invariants to hold. The only thing we expect of this is that it's destructible or assignable. And I don't like adding requirements to that where the point is, okay, so now people can write code that semantically doesn't make any sense.
So my position on your objects is that you get to decide what it does after it's been moved from, what it's capable of. And that is essentially just you writing documentation on what the preconditions are on all your functions. If you've got some object X with some member function foo on that, you might say a precondition of calling foo is that X is not in a moved from state. Done.
I just got a text from Richard. Hang on one second.
I've been ignoring the text box.
Well, no, he sent it to me on Skype, I think. Hang on a second. Let's get him involved in this conversation.
So Howard, Matt just brought up in chat that if we had a truly destructive move, we wouldn't have to weaken the invariance of our types. I think you were one of the people advocating for destructive moves. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say I've been advocating for it. I've been saying, well, in the original move paper that came out in 2002, there's a whole section on destructive move. And in a nutshell, that section says, we tried and we gave up, but if somebody else wants to do destructive move, more power to you. It could fit right alongside of non-destructive move, and the two would cooperate with each other. For example, there's really 4 types of move if you think about construction and assignment crossed with leaving the state constructed or leaving the source destructed. Vector alone could actually use 3 of those. In other words, it could use a function that move, constructs, and destructs the source all in one step. And that is when it's moving items from the old buffer to the new buffer during a reallocation. So destructive move is definitely useful. Vector could use it. It has issues. And I don't know the answers to those issues, but they're probably solvable. And I would love to see somebody work on it. I'm not volunteering.
Sorry, I'm distracted by this, and I have a question to follow up on this destructive move idea. In just 1 second, let me send this out.
So to me, this is a lot like pointers. We've been dealing with pointers forever. We know how to deal with pointers. If you've got a pointer to an object, you delete that. You better not go around using it anymore. And you know, if the primary purpose for move was for performance, then adding additional fluff seems like just a bad idea. Obviously, there's move-only objects, and we have to deal with this somehow. But if the primary impetus was actually for performance, adding those few extra cycles just seems like not what we wanted to do.
Yeah, well, I agree 100%. Move is about performance, and we should strive to not degrade that motivation.
Well, the problem I'm seeing is I think people are going to respond to that by saying, as we said earlier about the standard containers, well, it's not really that expensive. What I'm trying to say, though, is that we need to think about how we. Hey, Richard, how are you? We need to think about how we want to tell people to think about moved from objects, and I think that encouraging them to think about them as anything other than in this partially formed state is the wrong thing to think about. And it's less about what you said earlier, Howard, about, well, you define the preconditions of your library and you're fine to do that. And I'm thinking, I think that's looking at the wrong thing. It's ignoring the code that's using that library. And I don't see any. And I know you gave an example on Jonathan's blog where you posted a little snippet of code and say, see, this is a situation where you use this move from object to do something interesting. And I looked at that and I immediately said, well, why don't you just swap it? You have nice semantic meaning and essentially make the same thing. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is that destructive move, and just say, I'm not sure exactly because it was a bit distracted, didn't hear exactly what you said, but it seems like and I've seen a proposal where someone said, if we were to destruct objects as soon as they're moved from, then there's a performance advantage there. I don't know if that actually makes sense. I didn't quite like the proposal, but if you go around telling people, oh, well, you can move from an object and then go ahead and use it, that means you could never do that kind of optimization because you've promised more than I think we should deliver.
Well, destructive move would definitely be a different operation than what we now think of as move. It would be in addition to as opposed to instead of.
Okay. Well, the proposal I saw was something that would interpret a move as an immediate destruction, which is not what you proposed, and that was part of the reason why I was kind of skeptical it could even be pulled off. Did we have a couple of questions, Bryce? Are you muted?
Awesome.
Yes.
So while he's muted, I'm going to talk. Oh.
So Matt wanted to ask Howard, is there any chance the committee would ever add destructive moves in some form? And he also commented that destructive moves cause some standard library implementation to have moves which are not no except. And Matt says he thinks that Microsoft's implementation, for example.
Of the node-based containers, that's correct.
Yeah.
So yes, I think there is a possibility. I have seen. I think there's been proposals on destructive move. They aren't in. They won't be in the upcoming standard. They're not that far along, but I think it's definitely a possibility. It would not change the existing move. We would still keep our non-destructive move. It would just be additional functionality if we did it.
having move that aren't moves that aren't no accept is just the worst. So I certainly sympathize with what Matt's getting at there.
Yeah, throwing moves are problematic. They're so problematic that in the original move paper, I proposed that they not be allowed. But largely due to the issues with the Visual Studio implementation of node-based containers, we worked around those problems.
Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on why what those issues are?
Well, yeah, let's do that quickly. And I want to get Michael had something you want to say, and I want to introduce Richard and get him involved in the conversation too. So go ahead and answer that question, Howard, and then we'll.
Ooh, it's not a quick answer, but I'll try to say it quickly. Vector pushback is a wonderful example to start with. In fact, I think it may be the only example. In C++ 9811, vector pushback has the strong exception safety guarantee, which basically means if the pushback throws an exception, the vector will remain unchanged, as if it was if you hadn't called pushback at all. Now, to implement that means vector. If vector's doing a reallocation, it can't damage the old buffer as it creates the new buffer. And in C++ 98, the way you do that is you copy every element in the old buffer and put it in the new buffer, and the old buffer is there unchanged. But for performance reasons, we want to move elements from the old buffer to the new buffer. And when you do that, you, of course, modify the old buffer because you've moved from it. So if you can't do all those moves with a no-accept guarantee, then you really can't provide the exception safety guarantee of pushback that we wanted. And so now we have this thing called move if no accept, and vector pushback will move if it can, if it knows it won't throw an exception, otherwise it'll fall back to copy. So if you were to make, for example, if you had an implementation where list move construction throws and you had a vector of list and you pushed back to new list, you will get copy semantics during the reallocation instead of move semantics, much slower. Is that too confusing?
No, thanks. That makes sense.
All right, Michael, you had something, and we drove over you, I think.
It's okay. I'm used to Bryce driving over me. So I think a large amount of the debate comes down to just not really knowing the difference between an expiring R value and a pure R value. And so I think we should have a new binding, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 ampersigns, so that we can tell the difference between what is a pure R value and what is actually just expiring R value.
Did you read what Jens said in the chat room? He said he's directing it as is. He says if it's like a pointer, we could have unique move and shared move plus weak move.
I think I'm saying it's like a raw pointer. It's a raw pointer.
All right. Hey, so Richard has joined us a little late. I'm sorry to ignore you, but we were right in the middle of this conversation, and I hope you can figure out what we were talking about and maybe jump in. We were talking about moved from objects. But tell us a little bit about what's going on with you. You run the local user group in Salt Lake City, right?
That's correct. It's called Utah C++ Programmers on Meetup, and we've been going for about a year and a half, almost 2 years.
And I see when you make updates about what's going on in the meetings you do, and I'm always disappointed that I can't be there because it sounds like you have an awful lot of fun. You do very hands-on kinds of things. It's not just somebody comes in and talks about move semantics, but you actually are writing code and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, I am usually the presenter, so to keep things less boring, I try to make situations where we can do a group programming exercise and get everybody involved, so it's not just always me talking for an hour or two.
And why are you holding an Emmy?
I worked at Philips Digital Video Systems that won a technical Emmy for their Media Pool product, which was a real-time video streaming system for TV stations. And the interesting thing is that the video was uncompressed. So it was not MPEG video, it was raw pixels, and mostly TV stations use it. They store all their TV commercials on it and then play back their TV commercials because that's the stuff that changes the most frequently at a TV station. And so we got a technical Emmy for that, and then there was a chance for all of us to kind of mug it up with the Emmy.
Well, it looks great. So were you following what we were talking about if I was moved from objects?
Yes, and you know, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, and I haven't seen examples yet of where someone was attempting to do something interesting with an object after they moved from it. But my gut feeling is you're probably only tempted to do that because your function is too long, and it's doing too much. It's not following single responsibility principle. It's not got high cohesion. It's mixing together responsibilities, and you're tempted to take that variable that you moved from and do something else with it in a weird way. But that's just a gut feeling. I don't have any proof for that.
I will cop to this being one of my problems. Not so much with functions. Generally, I don't think my functions get terribly long. But my classes, they'll start out with a nice single idea, and over time, it's like, well, I could do that here, and I could add that here, and they just get bigger and bigger, and they kind of lose their cohesiveness. And it's just something that I tend to see myself doing. Something that I have to fight against.
We wasted many hours in the bar down at C++ Now talking about this over the past few years. You'd think it'd be over by now. But one of the things is that people bring up the fact that sometimes inside of library code that you actually can possibly end up with a state where you have an object and it has been moved from, and you don't really know that it's been moved from. Not because you did something to it, but something else did something to it. And you end up using that. So I think that's the concern that some people have. I don't have that concern. I think you should just assume that no invariants are held. You can move into, assign, and destroy, and that's it.
I'm for that, and I think the Standards Committee made a mistake in documenting the library in the way it did. It should have said, when in a partially formed state, that is in a moved from state, that all calls other than assignment and destruction are undefined.
Well, one thing that we have to keep in mind is I don't think the standard actually states anything except for the usage of your objects that you're going to provide to the library of what move means. And people are looking for more definitive answers, right? I know I get this when I'm teaching a C++ course all the time. People are asking, what should we as a company decide for policies about moved from objects? And we sit down and we talk about the two camps, and I try not to taint the conversation too much about my own opinion, but there have to be decisions made about what a moved from object is. And the standard isn't saying that this is what you need to do with moved from objects. It's saying that if you're going to use the algorithms, this is what we expect the behavior of an object is. And people want them to take that concept and move it along and say, well, this is what moved from means for all objects in all situations.
Well, I think the problem is not so much what the standard is saying about your objects in the library. I think the problem is what the standard is saying about standard objects. And it's saying it's setting the wrong model, I guess. In general, if your company writes code like the code that's in the standard, you're doing pretty well. That's pretty good code. That's not awful code. There are some flaws, and generally following the lead of the Standards Committee is a great idea. And I just think this is what people are likely to do incorrectly, which is to say, oh, well, if vector is defined this way, then my classes should be defined that way. And maybe that means that there are valid use cases for using these move from objects. And that's where I have the problem. It's not that somebody is documenting their library and saying this is what's going on, although I'm not happy with that. It's that people are then going to use it. And I think that library designers, of course, hold themselves to a very high ideal. I want to write things that make my caller's life as good as can be, right? That's what they want to hold. And so they're trying to do the right thing by saying, and these are the guarantees that I can provide, even for move from object. And what I'm saying is that's actually a disservice. I don't know what the good example is, but it's like it's kind of like somebody saying, oh, I have this new car, and it's practically watertight. You should be able to drive through a river with it. Well, that's not doing your customers a great service if somebody tries to drive through a river and they get washed away or drowned in the car.
So your position is the specification of vector is of too high a quality.
No, I think it would be a higher. No, that's my point exactly. The specification vector would be of a higher quality if it said that when it's moved from all these calls, that is other than destructor and assignment, all these calls are undefined. That's my point. Is that undefined behavior is a good thing, and in this case particularly, and say, don't do this because you shouldn't. You should be paying more attention to your code. If you've moved from something, don't try to reuse it.
So the standard tries to avoid creating guidelines, and it just says what is and what isn't. And so as a guideline, as a user of standard vector, I think you would be perfectly within your rights to follow that guideline. But what the standard actually does say is, here's the limits. Here's how far you can take it. If you want to call clear on a moved from vector or size on a moved from vector, no harm is done, because these functions have no preconditions.
Except what I would argue is harm is done. If you look at your code, you're violating the semantics of it. You're trying to say, I don't know. I think I've made myself clear. I should shut up. I think I'm repeating myself at this point.
Absolutely, but you're not violating anything that the standard has said. You might be violating what you feel is good code.
Yes, and I think the standard has encouraged people to do that. But I've said that before. So, anything else that we talked about? Did any of you look at the IEEE language ranking? Oh, I thought I had a link to that.
I have not seen it myself.
They are saying that C, not Java, is the most popular language, which was kind of a surprise to me. And they also say
it's IEEE.
He's saying they're only interested in certain kinds of programmers. Is that what you're saying?
I'm a member of IEEE.
Yeah.
I don't know that we exist. We don't say that Java exists, right? It's like C and things that are on hardware.
Well, they do say that Java is the #2 language, and then they say that Python is the #3, beating out C++.
I think this just indicates how bad our information is about statistics and programming languages. Because if you look at any of the major rankings, there's a good bit of variance in how they rank popularity of languages.
So here, this is what we could do. We can make this an interactive show for all 4 people who are currently watching. If you are a Spectrum reader or an IEEE member, press the thumbs up button now. There you go, John. I didn't see any.
Okay. All right. I just thought it was interesting how different this is than the TOB. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. The TOB index that we talked about a few weeks ago, which says that Java is significantly ahead of C, which is significantly ahead of C++, but it does have C++ beating out Python. So, yeah.
One thing to keep in mind is are you ranking what percentage of code out there is written in the language? Are you ranking what percentage of programmers out there know the language, or are you ranking how popular the language is? There's like a billion different ways that you can ask this question and you get different answers depending on that.
So I think that's actually the most important observation about all these surveys, is that the methodologies are so all over the map that there's not really any. I mean, it's kind of, it's like 9 out of 10 dentists recommend a particular toothpaste. And it's like, yeah, because they get that toothpaste free from the toothpaste company, so of course they recommend it. A lot of these things have built-in self-bias to them, and the way that they're done, they're not really drawing objective conclusions. And the thing that always makes me chuckle whenever I'm forced to install Java is how the Java, because it comes from exactly one place, they can boast 9 billion downloads of Java. Yeah, but C++ is in probably 30 billion devices.
Well, every
Because
place that Java is, C++ is, right? Isn't the
Right,
Java
I mean-
runtime written in C++?
So, I mean, but because it comes from a single source, they get to have a certain amount of boasting.
Yeah.
C++ doesn't come from one single place, so there isn't a way for them to aggregate any kind of statistic into one place where you can impress people like, oh, look at that, C++ is in 30 billion devices. And the same is true for all these surveys where they do this measurement. They measure by looking at all the projects on GitHub. Well, tons of C++ code is commercial code, and it's not on GitHub.
No, I kind of agree with you. Methodologically, it's very challenging, although that doesn't necessarily mean it's intentionally biased. It's just a really hard problem. But I even go further than that. I say, suppose you had perfect knowledge. Suppose somehow you could, in fact, know what every programmer on Earth is actually doing. You'd still have a difficult time dividing it up, because you're going to have some people who write Python one week and C++ the next week, or they write, 10% of their job is writing Python and 90% of their job is being a database administrator. Well, is that person a Python programmer? It's just, even if you had perfect knowledge, even if you knew what everybody was doing, it would still be hard to rank these libraries. It's kind of like Bryce was saying, is, well, what are you saying? Is most used, most popular, most lines of code, most projects. There's just a lot of ways to slice it.
Yeah, this is an issue particularly close to my heart. Our supercomputing center here, one of my colleagues there had asked me recently, I realized we don't have very good statistics on programming language uses, and could you come up with some survey? But the interesting thing was that for us, he showed me the data that we do have, and C++ is still number 2, but it's number 2 to Fortran for us.
So you may be a bit of an atypical institution, is what you're saying.
Yeah, but I've been trying to think recently about how to create, a good survey to determine what programming languages are being used and how popular a particular programming language is at our facility, and it's hard.
Right. Well, like I said, even if you had perfect knowledge, suppose you have somebody who's, they downloaded Rust, they've played with it a little bit, then, maybe they wrote something that actually is used a little bit in their company just to kind of try it out. Well, are they a Rust user? How could you say no if they've written production Rust code? On the other hand, it sounds like it was more of an experiment.
Just to indicate how confusing the whole question is, just look at the tagline in the showcase. It says, C is number 1, but big data is still the big winner. What programming language is big data?
Okay, so here's the question I have for you. If you heard CppCast this week's CppCast, before we start talking about who they had on as a guest, there was some feedback they got from their previous guest. So the previous guest was Gabbie, who, while talking about what he was working on, modules and such, he made the statement that Visual C++, I think I've got him right on this, I think he said Visual C++ is used by more than half of all C++ programmers. And that caught a lot of blowback, but I think what he tried to say in clarification, because like I said, there's a lot of blowback on this. What he said is he's not saying it's the primary tool. He's saying but more than half of C++ programmers will use Visual Studio. So if you're writing in a cross-platform way, then they're gonna use Visual Studio for the Windows implementation at some point. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we do a lot of cross-platform, and I never run Visual Studio. That's what the build server is for. So
You're missing out.
I'd say about a third of my team is on Visual.
Okay.
I'll pipe in and say, I started with VI, then I went to Emacs as
Should
my
have stopped. Don't
IDE,
move.
and then I gave my pinky finger a reprieve, and I tried VC6, and I actually had an environment where I had Emacs installed on Windows, and I had VC6 side by side. And as I learned VC6, and it was side by side, so I could feel that I actually was more productive in Visual Studio, and I've stayed with Visual Studio ever since. But the closest thing that has come to teasing me away from Visual Studio is CLion for a Linux environment. And I mean, if Emacs had grown to the point where it now had like automated extract function and extract method and automated rename, if it had all kinds of fancy refactoring tool stuff in it, I'd be using Emacs again. But Emacs has pretty much stayed as a C++ development environment. It stayed exactly where it was in around the mid 90s when I left it. It doesn't seem to have progressed at all in terms of programmer productivity and the tools that it offers me.
So, as somebody who works purely in Linux and is at an like a 5,000 person organization where nobody, I don't think we have a Visual Studio license, and I've been in that sort of environment my entire career. Even I've used Visual Studio and am comfortable with Visual Studio. So I could kind of believe what Gabbie's saying, that sure, probably half of C++ programmers have used Visual Studio or are using it today. It may not be necessarily their main compiler or their main IDE, but I think it's probably the one that the most people have used.
And in fairness, I think on Linux, people are gravitating more towards Eclipse than Emacs. I mean, all the C++ devs I know that are Linux people are using Eclipse, and Eclipse does have some refactoring support, but it's still behind ReSharper and Visual Studio.
Not hearing a lot of support for BB Edit, but there you go.
Actually, that's what I use every day.
That's right. All right. There's the old dyed in the wool Mac user.
I can't understand people dissing on Emacs. I mean, it's an entire operating system right there. You've got everything you need.
Were you trying to say something good or something bad?
Good.
I'm a Vim
I think
person myself.
I'm just
Michael.
old. That's what it is. I must be an old-fashioned guy because I love my Emacs.
You know,
I'm a Vim person myself. I don't think we can be friends anymore.
I've
not.
heard all this wonderful stuff about Emacs. Scott Myers, he said, well, the editing wars is over. I mean, with Emacs, why, what else could you do? So I've tried to learn Emacs. Dave Abrahams was this big Emacs guy too, and so I tried to learn it, and I just felt like I had, kind of like boxing gloves on or something. I was just so handicapped when I could just pop up edit and do what I wanted to do. I really tried. I wanted to learn how to use it, and it was just no.
So I think, I mean, obviously, the whole editor war and Visual Studio and whatnot, it's really dependent upon the industry that you're in. And so, talking about editors without understanding what the end target is for the industry of whatever the company is probably just kind of a useless conversation.
Sure.
I know for a lot of people who do similar things as Kiera, where we write cross-platform code, often libraries, for other people, we just let our team use whatever they want. And whatever you're the absolute most productive in, whatever operating system, target, that's great, right? Cross-compatible code there, and we let the build servers work out the rest, and the blame logs figure out who has to go fix something. So
Yeah.
I think that's a lot better than trying to force people to use something. I do want to put a plug in for CLion. I'm kind of an anti-IDE person, but we have a client right now that's using it, and we've needed to make sure that projects export properly to it and such. And I've used it as a debugger, and I'm pretty impressed with it. It's I've secretly gone and actually used it instead of Emacs now a couple times to debug things.
Oh my gosh.
I hurt to say, by the way.
I think both Ben and Matt in the chat room are letting us know that game developers close to unanimity on the use of Visual Studio. But again, it's just what Michael said. It's what industry you're in. So anyway, what else do we want to talk about? Well, I brought up CppChat. This week's guest was Matt Bentley. I thought it was a great interview. It was a lot of fun to listen to. I would really like to hear Howard's thoughts on it if you got a chance to listen to it, because he was talking about containers.
I wish I had listened to it. I will listen to it right after this talk, which will unfortunately be just too late.
So he basically wanted to do some game development, and he thought Vector was pretty cool, but the problem with Vector was that, in his, I don't know game development, but I guess very often you want to delete objects, and that requires that you're in the vector. Of course, that's going to invalidate iterators and pointers, and so he developed a container where deleting objects didn't invalidate anything else, but it still had the characteristics, kind of a vector-like characteristic, and also would do constant time iteration even when skipping over deleted objects. So I thought it was kind of interesting. The one thing that I thought was most interesting was he also has a stack class where the interface is essentially like any other stack class. It's just really fast. And he said, and they asked him, they meaning Rob and Jason, asked him if he was going to propose this as a standard container. And he said, well, I can't, because in the standard there are container requirements, and one of the container requirements is that a container has to have iterators. And my stack class doesn't have any iterators, and of course, no stack class would have iterators. That kind of defeats the point of its stack class. And so he says, I could submit it, but it wouldn't be considered a container class. And I couldn't help but laugh at that.
And he's going to be speaking at CppCon about his library and some of his work.
Yeah.
Sounds like a very interesting talk. I'll have to see that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Could you bring that container into the library by creating, dividing the concept of container into iterable containers and non-iterable containers? I guess what does it mean to have a non-iterable container? It's only stack.
I don't think it's necessarily true that all data structures or container-like things in the library need to actually be containers. And I think right now LEWG has been looking at proposals for a number of things that have not had iterators. For example, the multi-dimensional array ref thing that we really need a better name for has not had iterators in some iterations of the proposal. So I think the door is open to explore designs of container-like things that are not actually, containers with a capital C.
And said another way, there are other chapters in the standard besides Chapter 23.
Well, I know Scott has made the point when talking about singly linked list. He says, this interface is completely uncontainer-like. It's completely unlike any other container because, of course, all the other containers, if you have insert, you insert where your iterator is pointing to, not after where your iterator is pointing to, which for singly linked list is the only way you could do it. And he said, it's just the interface is any table that says these are the common calls on a container are going to have exceptions for standard for the singly linked list.
Yeah, that's kind of a bike shedding issue.
Yeah, one should look at those table of requirements for the containers as documentation as opposed to requirements. They're documenting just what's in the standard.
Yeah. And you're suggesting that nobody would object to having stack as a container just because it doesn't have iterators? We could update the table to...
No, I'm not saying that nobody would object to it. I'm just saying that just because just because people might object to it doesn't mean that it's not worth having a conversation about it. And I certainly think that even if people who would object to it would be open to, considering it and looking at new directions.
You can't really propose anything without somebody objecting to it, no matter how wonderful a proposal. You never can please everybody.
Was that a slip? The everybody versus the anybody?
A definite slip.
Do you remember? I spoke with you in Santa Cruz right after you had presented the first paper on move semantics. Do you remember this conversation?
Oh my gosh, that would have been 15 years ago.
Yeah, it was a long.
I don't remember the exact conversation. I remember being there and presenting it, of course.
Well, I asked you because I missed it. I came down to see the committee, and I asked you about it because you'd sent me a copy of the paper because you and I were talking, and I was talking about swap, and you said, well, swap's not that. I was saying swap is a fundamental thing because I'm all into this, exception safety stuff, and so we like swap. And you said, well, swap's not really that fundamental. It's just two moves, which of course made me think two moves. You may have an algorithm that I don't know about to actually pull off swap in two moves. But anyway, then you sent me the paper, and I read it, and then you presented it, and I came down and I asked you. I said, well, how did it go? And you said, I think it went pretty well, but people were not happy about the syntax. And I said, well, what do they propose as an alternative? I think they didn't like the two ampersands. It's like ampersands, references are confusing enough. We don't want two references or something like that. And you said, well, they didn't really have a good, strong proposal, but somebody suggested a new keyword. And just to see your eyes light up, and you said, I could have had a keyword?
Yeah, I'd love to have a new keyword. I want a pony too.
I mean, a new keyword is like the dream. And not only that, but like a new keyword that's not like an awful keyword, like something weird like Const. Like a new keyword is the dream, and like you never really think that you could possibly get it.
There you go. So anyway, what else do we want to talk about? Oh, I had another chuckle this week when I was looking on Reddit. I don't know if I saw a post. I think this was in reply. I'm not sure what thread this was, but someone replied to one of STL comments where STL had used as an example meow, and someone had just replied to his comment saying meow, STL confirmed, and I knew exactly what he meant because when I first started reading the subreddit, and I would see STL, and I would think, well, is that somebody just being clever about the library, or is that actually STL? And I just didn't know until I saw an example where he did something with meow, and I said, oh, nope, STL confirmed. So, but we don't need that anymore. In Reddit, Reddit now supports flair. Did you guys know that? Did you see that announcement from STL? I guess he's the moderator or one of the moderators for that subreddit, right?
I did not know that.
Yeah, so you can go in and you can put whatever your flair is. I think I said that with CppCon and C++ now, but you can identify yourself. This is one of my pet peeves about Reddit is that even if I figure out who somebody is, I'd like to be able to go in and say, well, when you see this name, when this person responds, I'm going to type in the name I want you to show them to me as. That way I can remember. Because people have these cute little names, and I don't know who they are or sometimes I figured it out, and then I don't know later.
This is also John's complaint with IRC.
Bryce, do you have a cute little name?
I go by the tag Wash.
Yeah.
But do you have a cute one?
I don't think I do.
John, you can tag users on Reddit. How do you do that? Maybe I'm just a newbie. I know how to make them friends, but I don't know how to change their name. That's what I want to do. I want to change the person's name so that so that I see them with the changed name. I don't want to, well, maybe I would like to change it for everybody, but I don't expect that kind of power. But I would like to see, once I figure out who somebody is, I'd like to tag them and say, always show me with this name. What else do we want to talk about? There was a Arne Mertz wrote a blog on Const correctness, which the most important thing about that blog from my point of view was I learned about something called propagate const, which I thought was kind of interesting. You want to explain that to us, Howard?
Propagate const?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, not really.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, give me 5 or 10 minutes to look it up and study it, and I'll explain it to you.
Well, I think it's. I'm not even sure whether it came in with. I hadn't heard about it before, so maybe it's a 17 only thing. But essentially, what it is you can you have a propagate const that you wrap around a pointer, and then when something's called on that pointer, if the pointer is const, it propagates it. So the idea is that we have this weird
deep const, I think it's referred to.
Yeah, that's kind of what it is about. Where you basically, if I have an object and my object is const and my object has a pointer to something else, making my object const means I can't change the pointer or you can't change the pointer. But if it's a pointer to an int, you can change the int. So if you say propagate const, what happens is that if your object is const, then what you're pointing to is also not going to be modifiable. Right? I think I got that right. And
yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
I am seeing it in the current draft, though.
Yeah, maybe 7. Oh.
I might have misspelled it.
I saw a link to it in CPP reference, and I read about it there. So it has to be somewhere. But we're getting close to the end here. Anybody have any final words?
CppCon, September 18th to 23rd. Go, register now.
That's right. And
talks, 7 tracks.
If you're a creative person or visually creative person, we have a contest going on now for T-shirt design. And so it would be really cool if you have a flair in this area and want to have your design on hundreds of C++ programmers' clothing.
The T-shirt I always wanted to make was one that just says, "By the power of Void Star, I command thee."
And we'll probably have some more announcements about plenary speakers and panels next week.
I think we're at this point. We kind of have finally figured out what we're doing with all the plenaries. In fact, I got to talk with you about who we're going to have introduce all the plenaries, because not only do we have plenary speakers, we kind of want to have an introduction to them. But that's something we'll take care of. Anyway, thank you guys all for joining us. It's been a lot of fun, and hope we get to have a chance to have you back so that we can further explore move semantics, because that's just such an adventure.
Well, thank you for
Bryce will
having
knock
me.
it up early again.
I've enjoyed being here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, thank you very much, Howard. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Bryce. And everybody, safe coding.
Safe coding.
All right. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.